1950, you got to remember, the Canadians wrote a top secret memo in 1950 based upon what the Americans had told Wilbert Smith, who was a high-level Canadian guy. And he said the Americans told the officials, not people on the street, officials told me the following things. Flying saucers exist. It's the most highly classified subject in the United States, rated 2 points higher than the hydrogen bomb, which would not be built till 2 years after the memo was written. It's of tremendous significance to the Americans, and there's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush who are trying to figure out the modus operandi.
Welcome back. I'm here again with Grant Cameron. Grant, welcome back. It's good to see you, friend.
Well, thanks for having me back on. I appreciate all the times we get to talk and exchange ideas.
100%. All right. I'm going to be dancing around a kind of a notorious figure in ufology, but I will lead the horse to water, and if it gets a little bit too dangerous, I will change, I'll stop you. So let's start delicately. What is the Weird Desk? Like, what history do you know about it? Who were some of the members in the past, and what's its fundamental purpose?
Okay, my understanding is, as some of them, like Kit Green, who was one of the directors, basically said it's not really a desk. There's no desk there. It's just a slang term that in the CIA, you've got some guy who deals with all the weird stuff, all the paranormal stuff and all the UFO stuff and stuff like that. And I believe my first impression, it started with Art Lundahl. So Art Lundahl was a CIA agent or an officer, and he was most notorious he created digital film. So when they took satellite photographs, learned to digitalize the photographs so that you could actually get very high resolution by digitalizing it. And he was the guy that analyzed the films for the Robertson Panel report. He had a Navy photographic lab when he did it for the Robertson Panel, and they liked him so much that they brought him in to the CIA to set up a lab at the CIA. So he created what was called the National Photographic Interpretation Center, which analyzed all the U-2, the SR-71, and all the spy photographs. And it was underneath a car dealership in Washington, D.C., in the slum, because it was so highly classified that they didn't want the Russians to find it. So they put it in this slum. And apparently the people around the area they thought the U.S. government was printing money in this building because there was so much security around this building. They figured, why is this building got all this security in the middle of this slum? And it was basically where they would analyze the photographs. And Art Lundahl was responsible for leaking two things to my friend Robert Emenegger, who did the documentary UFOs Past, Present, Future. And if you listen, I think Semivan talked about it at one time. Semivan talked about being briefed twice. And the one briefing, he said he was told to get a conference room for 6 to 8 hours inside the CIA. And he said the guys that came in to brief him were guys who had do not escort badges, so they could walk anywhere in the CIA. And he said every single one of them had as many tickets as I had. And these guys sat in this room, and he said, this scared the living daylights out of me. So they basically gave this whole thing. Now, he said he knows what the legacy programs are. He said he's not going to talk about it. And he also talked at one brief moment about the communication programs, that the U.S. government has actually had communication. And he said, well, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to talk about that. So I think the programs they're talking about was, number one was this 1959 channeling session that took place at the CIA. And I have released that document. It was given to me, I think, by Jacques Vallée. I had the story, and then they sent me the document. You got the story, here's the document. And basically what it was two Navy intelligence guys, one that was also working for the CIA, were watching a woman in Elliott, Maine. Her name was Frances Swan. She was a channeler. And she claimed at one point that the aliens were talking to her, and she had this thing in her ear, and they're making this noise when they're talking to her. And she got angry and said, quit making the noise. And then she eventually went from automatic writing to being able to just directly channel. And she was channeling a couple of aliens by the name of Alpha and Ponar.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
And the Canadians were they were watching her. They were very interested. That was Wilbur Smith was going down there, getting her, asking her questions about these beings and stuff like that. And these Navy intelligence guys were also watching her. So in 1954, they were down in Elliott, Maine. And then they went back in 1959. And the explanation they had for why they went to see her was they wanted to get some flight time. So they went there, and then they were getting her, they were channeling, and she was talking to Alpha. And so they're in this thing, and then she said, well, why don't you just do it yourself? And so the one guy sat in the chair, she put her hand on his right shoulder, and suddenly this guy starts this automatic writing, and he's talking to Alpha. So he goes running back to Washington, D.C., and he's working at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, and he gets in there, and Art Lundahl's running it, and Art Lundahl was, everybody knew, was totally fascinated with UFOs. So he went in there and he said, she taught me how to channel. She taught me how to do this. I can do it. And then Lundahl says, okay, sit down. Let's talk to the alien. So they sit him down, and this is actually in UFOs Past, Present, Future, which is on the internet. It's called UFOs That Has Begun. They did a second version in 1979, UFOs That Has Begun. You can watch this whole thing. And they got Robert Friend from Blue Book. They had a Blue Book telling this story about being in this broken down facility above the car dealership in Washington. And he'd been called in. They were so amazed by what had happened. They called him in from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He went in 2 days later. But the actual event, this guy sits down, and they start talking to Alpha, and they're saying, do you prefer one religion? And no, and all. They're asking all these questions. And then Art Lundahl, who's running the interview, talking to this guy, says to him, and he's doing automatic writing, talks to him, and he says, we'd like some proof. And then the guy goes from writing to actually talking. And he said, what do you want? And he said, we want you to show yourself. And then the guy responds, when? And they said, now. And then the guy channeling goes, go to the window. And they go to the window, and according to Robert Friend, you'll see it in the documentary, he said, this flying saucer flies by over top of the Capitol, and it's daylight. It's the middle of the day. So they were so amazed by this that they called Robert Friend in 2 days later, and they put this guy into trance again. And they got him there, and then they said, we'd like you to show yourself. And then the AFA said the time is not right, and that was called off. So Robert Friend went back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he said to the general that was his commanding general, he said, this is amazing. I saw this guy's Adam's apple was moving up and down. There was something really going on here. We should investigate this case. This is amazing. It's the best case I've ever seen. And then the general said, another agency is handling it. Hands off. And that was the last thing we heard about that story. So that story was given to Robert Emminger. So there's all these stories that the government doesn't leak stuff, that it's and they're leaking stuff all the time. There's no way Emminger would have got that story if it had not been for Art Lundahl telling it. And so that's when we learned this whole thing about how the game is played. So Emminger says to Arthur Lundahl, the first director of this Weird Desk thing, he said, well, can you tell the story? Can you go on camera to tell the story? He said, no, I can't. He said, well, why not? He said, I'm on duty. I can't do it. And that's the whole deal. When you're operational, you can't. When you get off, like Chase Brandon or these people, say you worked in the Army, you saved the world from nuclear devastation. You want to tell your story. They say, okay, Sean, you can tell your story. Change the names, change the dates. We're going to put it through the Dopser. And they basically let you tell your story in fiction. So that's basically the whole idea, is that once you're not operational, but Lundahl was operational, so I can't do it. And the other story that they gave him was the Holloman Air Force Base story. And this one, if you followed this thing over the years, I've had it for many years. I worked on this story, and I was actually dealing with the NIDS people back in 2000, about the time that the Wilson leak document. I was dealing with Eric Davis. And it was that point he gave me the notes for the Advanced Physics Theoretical Working Group that I eventually put out. And so the one story that was in Jacques Vallée's book that I went public with the whole story was that Eric Davis had actually talked to George Bush. And he tells this story, he's told it a couple times, about George Bush being briefed not as president, but as CIA director, and being shown this 15-minute Holloman Air Force Base film. And the Holloman Air Force Base film is Close Encounters of the Third Kind. When I talked to Bob Emminger, I said, hey, Bob, this story of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, if it weren't for the date and the time, that sounds like the Holloman Air Force Base story. And he said, why, I didn't tell you? And I said, no, you didn't tell me what? He said, I didn't tell you, give a copy to Steven Spielberg. I said, no, you didn't tell me that. And he said, I told you. Annie Spielberg, his sister, was a line producer for me. And she said Steven would like a copy of the documentary. So in 75, they give this copy of the Holloman AFB story to Steven Spielberg. And in 77, it's exactly the same story, except they changed the location and the time and stuff like that. And then Bob Emenager told me that after it was all over, Steven Spielberg's mother came to him and said, I've seen your version of the landing and I've seen Steven's version of the landing, and I like Steven's version better.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
So that was the second one that they were given. And the other thing was that Eric Davis, because all the NIDS people were trying to figure this out. They were trying to figure out the black triangles. They were trying to figure out cattle mutilations. They were trying to figure out all sorts of different things. And one of the things they were looking at was, can we confirm the Holloman Air Force Base story? And so Davis actually talked also to Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford confirmed that he had been shown the film and he had been briefed on the Holloman Air Force Base thing when he became president. And that's when he said to him, well, can you tell me when the briefing was? And Ford said, I'm never going to tell you where the briefing was. Don't even go there. And when he was talking to Bush, he said to Bush, according to the last version that Eric Davis told, was really bizarre, that they didn't realize they hadn't been briefed. That when he was CI director, thought he knew it, and they were briefing it. And then Bush went, what? And suddenly the guy realized he hadn't been briefed on this thing. He's telling this story about this landing at Holloman Air Force Base. And so Emenager had the story, and Ford confirmed it. And I learned about it because Eric Davis called me and wanted Jimmy Carter's phone number. And I said, well, I don't have Jimmy Carter's phone number. Like, why do I have Jimmy Carter's phone number? Because he wanted to talk to Jimmy Carter. But he could talk to Ford and he could talk to Bush, because they were both members of the former intelligence agency, this agency that they have, this group. And so there's like the secret handshakes, and so they can talk to each other. And Carter had never been in the military. I mean, he had not been part of the intelligence people. So
yeah, he was in the military, though. He was
in the military, but this former intelligence officers, like Richard Doty's, he always talks about talking to people in that thing and stuff like that. So anyway, they were getting the Holloman Air Force Base story, but that was one of the other stories that was leaked to Bob Emenager. But it was the same thing. It was plausible deniability. Like, now we actually know, and I'll make this public. They showed me one where they showed that the object, that we always had the idea that there was 8 seconds of film that was put in there. And I went to Bob. I said, Bob, there's 8 seconds of the film. Why would they give you 8 seconds? They told you to take the film back. He said, yeah, they told me these 2 people had to take back in this little tiny Datsun across the country back to Coleman at the Pentagon. And he said, no, the film was taken back. I said, but there's 8 seconds, Bob. And then he said, well, it was background. It didn't mean anything. And then I got the idea mistakenly that this was the actual film. And I forgot that the original thing is like the Close Encounters of the Third Kind. There's not one object coming over the mountains. There's 3 objects come over the base, and then the 2 of them go. The one looks like it's in trouble, and the 2 go away, and the 1 lands. And that's the thing. So the one guy did an analysis, and I went after him, and I said, this is garbage. And he said it was an F4. And then he said he had the digital copy. He had a high-definition digital copy that was done in 2007. And then Corbell showed me this, and I went and looked, and sure enough, Bob had taken it, and the screen was reduced. So there was a part of the bottom of the screen that appears on the digital one that doesn't appear on the other one. And I thought the guy had faked this thing. And he actually had the real film. And it does look like an F4 coming in. And so the whole thing is, they said they pulled the film. So they had to storyboard the thing. So they have the guys in the control tower talking and stuff like that. And then you see this object coming in and identify yourself. And everything was made up. And even the beings, when they just talk about the beings, and this is something that I will release, is that the beings are actually, that was not the beings looked like. That was given by Shardle, described that. And I asked Bob, I said, how did you get that, how the beings looked? And he said, well, my storyboard guy was drawing it and Shardle was describing what it was. What it is, it's an actual statue in, I think it's a museum in London. When you see the one from Holloman Air Force Base and you see this, you go, that's what they're describing. And so they basically put out the story, but everything is fake. Like, it's an F4, the being is not what the being looked like and stuff like that. And that's why I said to Bob, I said, well, what do you mean background? He said, well, it didn't show anything. And that was the whole thing. You didn't actually see the photograph of the being or the craft up close. And that's how they play these games. So I always say that the way they're playing the game is they're not disclosing and they're not covering up. Because if they wanted to cover up, they do what the Canadians do, or what the Belgians do, or the people from Finland do, is don't do anything. Just shut up and everybody will suddenly forget about it. Why do you keep dragging this thing out and bringing whistleblowers out and stuff? Because they want it out The Americans seem to be in control of this disclosure thing. So you want it out, but you can't confirm it. So you give it to bad witnesses. Like you give it to Bob Lazar, who's missing two things. And they know the story is going to blow up. They know it's going to blow up in his face. And then it's all plausible deniability. And you get the story out and you say, you don't spill the milk. Because the whole thing is, don't give them the actual classified material. But you can't have people back in 1947. So Art Lundahl was the first director, and I heard all sorts of stories about how fascinated. I found some correspondence that he had with a number of people, including James McDonald. And he would say to James McDonald, next time you're in Washington, let's sit down and talk about the most important subject there is, UFOs. But you could tell that he really didn't seem to know that much, or that he wasn't giving to James McDonald that much. And they would sit and talk about UFOs. And so the idea is there's a place at the CIA where you have to handle this kind of stuff. So the next one after him was Kit Green. And Kit Green admits, he said, but only 10% of his time was on this weird stuff. And he admits that there was like a weird desk, but it wasn't really a desk. It was just, you had to go somewhere. So it came to them. And then the claim was that he was the mentor for Ron Pandolfi. So Ron, I think, comes in 1983. I think he's 22 years old. He's this very interesting kid who wrote a paper at 16 years old about metal. And I think it was a UFO metal. I mean, you don't quote me on this, but he did the analysis of this and suddenly got a visit from two men in black. And that's how they picked him up. And that's how the CIA, according to Bill Moore, and according to the way I understand it, that's how they work. You go into the universities and you find out who are the people that are winning the gold medals and stuff like that, and you're trying to recruit those very high-level people from universities. And that was supposedly how they got Ron early on, that they picked him up. So at 22 years old, he's already in the White House, engaging and sort of briefing. The idea is that the guy that runs the weird desk is the guy that briefs the president. And people say, no, that's not true. Ron's not briefing the president. Kit Green doesn't brief the president. But Kit Green actually said he did talk to a number of presidents about UFOs. And Art Lundahl said he briefed a number of presidents about UFOs. And Ron, so 83, so you'd have Reagan, you'd have Bush, you'd have Clinton and Bush and Biden and now Trump. And one of the emails that he'd sent to somebody just recently said that he was retiring and that Joe Biden had approved his retirement, which sort of confirms this idea that he may be the guy that briefs the president. And we do know for a fact, because I recovered the Rockefeller documents in 2000. These are these 1,000 pages of documents between Lawrence Rockefeller and the science advisor to the president. So we know from the documents that Ron was pulled into this thing. So they heard Rockefeller's coming to the White House. You can't deal with the president. The president's got to be a dummy. You can't drag the president into this. As Ron Pandolfi said, the president cannot touch this subject. You can't put him in there because then it's like question. It just dominates the whole thing. You want to pretend he doesn't know what's going on, and he's got plausible deniability. And so what happened with the science advisor, they got him to go to the science advisor, which cuts him off. And then what was happening is the science advisor all the material was going through Hillary Clinton's office, and she was in the West Wing of the White House. So Hillary Clinton would go to Bill Clinton at night and say, Rockefeller wants this is what's happening and whatever. And then Bill would give her instructions. She'd go back to the science advisor and they would go with keeping the president out of this thing. But what happened was that Gibbons was the science advisor to the president. I mean, he claimed he didn't know what was going on with UFOs. So what are you going to do? You got to get a briefing. So he calls for a briefing from the CIA. And who do they give it to? We know for a fact they give it to Ron Pandolfi. But Ron Pandolfi can't do the briefing because the CIA we don't do UFOs. So you can't have, because they know Rockefeller isn't going to go public with Rockefeller. You can't. So what he does is he calls Bruce Maccabee in the night before and he says, we need a briefing for the president. I need you to do this briefing for the president. It has to be on the president's, on the desk of the science advisor, 8 o'clock in the morning. They're going to give Rockefeller a briefing. And so Maccabee stays up all night and he has all these attachments and he spends all this time and he goes there and he gets it in just before 8 o'clock. And then they say, oh, sorry, we actually give the briefing to him at 7 o'clock in the morning. And it was a briefing that was produced by another guy called the Matrix of UFO Beliefs, another guy that was working in the sort of the UFO area that had written it. But the whole idea is if Maccabee does the briefing, then it's not a briefing. It's always this plausible deniability. The CIA did not do this. This was Maccabee. And so you avoided the issue. But we had a conversation between Scott Jones, if you remember, he was one of the Avery, he was one very powerful Avery guy, had the human potential foundation. Rockefeller was financing him. And there's a conversation that he taped between him and Pandolfi talking about this briefing a couple days after. So we know that at least at the science advisor to the president, Ron is called in for the briefing and this whole idea. So they would bring in Maccabee, theoretically. Maccabee gives this, nonsense stuff off the street guy that it doesn't mean anything. And then after that, then if you need, then you go in and you get the president to sign off. This is a briefing. This is a classification, because that's the whole idea. And whether the president's briefed or not, the only people that are going to know ever if the president is briefed or not are the president and the guy who briefed him. Because you have all these GS-15 guys like Elizondo and Gresh and people like this. But how do you know if you're at a GS-15 level? How do you know what's happening at the higher level? You only know if you were in the briefing. And so there's always this controversy about whether the president knows. And I would say that the president wants to know, and I've heard this numerous times, if the president wants to know, they will move mountains to make sure the president knows. Because what are you going to do? I mean, it's like they came to me when Trump first went in, and they wanted me to help with a briefing. They were going to give a briefing to Rance Priebus, who was his first chief of staff. And then he said, we want to know where the bodies and crafts are. I go, I don't know where the bodies and crafts are. What are you going to give a guy a briefing for? This doesn't make any sense. And they said, well, they're not going to tell him. I said, well, who's not going to tell him? And he said, well, they're not going to tell him. I said, what do you mean, who's they? I said, when Trump comes in, he fires, CIA, everybody leaves. So he appoints a CIA director, he appoints his national security advisor, he appoints the head of intelligence, he appoints all these people. And if they all lie to him, well, then who's to blame? I mean, I have no sympathy. I mean, he can fire anybody he wants. And in fact, they're even talking like with Musk about firing everybody. They can fire everybody they want and put their own people in there, and that's the whole idea. So this is the whole idea about the you have to have a thing at the CIA to handle this, and even you have Ron. The rumored story was that Ron was involved in the shutting down the remote viewing program in 1995. It was in DIA, and Ron wanted it moved to CIA, and they wouldn't put him on the bigot list, because they knew if he got on the bigot list, he could move it. And then he managed to get it to the CIA, and they immediately shut the thing down. The same thing as he's saying now. Loons, crooks, and worse. This is all nonsense. And, and they file the thing away, and it just, all they do is change the level of classification to move it to the NSA or, move it somewhere else. And it's at a deeper, higher level. So Ron's been involved in a lot of this stuff, and he's the latest. And now the story is, and when I posted it, and this is a couple of days ago, the story was, he kept posting on, what they post on is what's called Open Minds Forum. And I don't know if you've ever been on there. But Open Minds Forum is the thing, it'll just give you a headache to read this stuff. It's all a bunch of poetry, but it's all like code, and it's all in code. And if you know what the code means, this is like intelligence people going on there and talking. And so Ron will come on there. First, he was called the Footman, and then he changed his name to Real Ron. And he said to me, that's not me. That was one of my interns. I said, Ron, you have a very distinctive writing style. I know exactly how you write. And so he changed his name, and that's the whole thing. So they put these little messages, and one of the messages was that Ron was going to retire. The hourglass is coming down at the end of the month. The new guy won't be here till January the 15th. And then there's going to be an announcement before Bush comes in. That was one of the things that this Real Ron had put on there. But it was all in this coded, poetic nonsense.
You mean before Trump comes in?
Before Trump comes in, which would indicate that maybe Biden is going to drop this thing as he's going out the door, which has happened before. Like if you take a look at the famous documentary called UFO Cover-Up Live, famous documentary. This is where the Avery is introduced, the live alien at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the strawberry ice cream, all that stuff. That was all in that documentary. And that happened a couple weeks before Reagan left office. And it was almost like Reagan was leaving a present. So they leaked a bunch of stuff in that thing as well. It was all like plausible deniability.
What's strawberry ice cream? Remind me.
Well, this is the whole idea where Richard Doty comes forward and Robert Collins comes forward as the Condor. Richard Doty's the Falcon, and the MJ-12 document, and they talk about the Holloman Air Force Base film, and they have a live feed to Russia, and they have these people in Russia talking about UFOs, and this is on live TV in the United States, and it was supposed to get massive audiences, and it didn't. It got a couple million, but it didn't get massive audiences, and that's where they introduced the idea that there was a live alien. So before that happened, everybody believed, because of the Roswell document, the MJ-12 document said that there was a crash and there's 4 dead aliens. But as we went on, when the Roswell researchers were doing it, more and more people came forward and said, no, there wasn't 4 dead aliens, there was 3 dead aliens, and there was 1 live alien. And this is where they get this whole idea, EBE-1, EBE-2, EBE-3, that they have these 3 aliens that were guests of the United States. Well, the first one was the Roswell one. Then there was one in the 60s. The last one for sure, EBE3, was in the 90s. And that's what Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray were trying to do. They called it bird code. There was these codes going back and forth that they were picking up. And it was these intelligence guys who like to play these stupid games, like these word games, and figure this thing out and put it in code and stuff like that. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to find the location where they were storing EBE3, which was in Washington off the Washington Mall. And Jamie Chandray found the location after EBE3 apparently had gone home. So they introduced this whole idea about the live alien. And now we sort of know, even Dr. Eric Walker, I wrote the book on Eric Walker, and we put all his transcripts in there. This is the guy that ran the institute, chairman of the Institute for Defense Analysis, 14 honorary doctorate degrees, chairman of, the president of Penn State University and stuff. And at one point he says to us, we're asking about Roswell, about the dead bodies. And he said, how do you know they're dead? How do you know they just didn't get up and walk away? And then how do you know they can get up and walk away? And I go, oh, this is nonsense. This is just like, disinformation stuff. And then I heard it Seoul. It's not my story, so I can't really tell you who said it, but one of my friends was at Seoul sitting beside a very high level guy. I mean, in the UFO community, like the sharpest knife in the drawer. And they're talking about the crash at Kingman, Arizona. And then it's on the Fox documentary and the dead aliens and stuff. And this guy was saying, no, that's not right. That's not right. No. They walked away. They left the craft and they walked away. And I'm thinking, he actually said that? And I was told, yeah, that's what he said. And I go, Walker was right. He was telling us this in 1990. He was telling us, and he said, and that's what he said. Most of the stuff you assume, you're assuming stuff, and most of the stuff you got is wrong. And he laughs away, and stuff like that. But I still started going back to the Walker thing, and I started to realize like he was actually telling us what was going on. He told us the whole thing about ESP. Unless you understand about ESP and how it works, you will not be taken in by the control group. The control group is a group of very elite people. Unless you have the mind of Einstein, you're not going to get anywhere with this, and leave it alone. You're never going to figure this thing out. And that has all been basically confirmed that we still can't figure it out. It's got this consciousness aspect to it and stuff like that. So the weird desk is, and that's the way I got to it was when I had my UFO sighting. I had the first night, the thing flew in front of the car, and there was no doubt. I mean, I never wanted to see a UFO after that. It was like, holy cow. It was like, it just blew my mind. And then the second night it came at me, and then it made this turn, and it was sort of flying away back, sort of where the direction it came. And I remember I'm looking at it and I'm going, what's it doing? It's not doing anything. It's just flying along. And I always ask people when they have the UFO say, what was it doing? And they go, I don't know, it wasn't doing anything. And that's where I get this theory of, wow, they're not doing anything. They just want you to see the UFO. They want you to go, what the hell's going on? And so it was flying away. And then I thought, that could be an extraterrestrial from another planet. I go, wow, that is so cool. I'm so lucky. I never thought I'd see a miracle like this. And I was just so amazed. And then I'm thinking, but what's it doing? And then I thought, well, I don't know what's going on, but somebody's got to know what's going on. So that's my whole 50 years. As of next May will be 50 years. My whole pursuit was to find somebody who knew what was going on and listen very carefully, not to really engage them, but to sit on the sideline and try to find all the writings where they had written. That's what I did with Walker. I went to Penn State University. He had hundreds of thousands. I can't believe a guy could produce that much paper, hundreds of thousands of pages of paper, and all his speeches to see had he talked about UFOs. And a couple of times I caught him like talking about UFOs and stuff like that. And that's what I did is I figured these high-level people, the president, that's why I went after the president of the United States, and that's why I went after Pandolfi. So Pandolfi's got sort of a reputation that, he's just playing with people, he's just whatever. And yeah, he's doing that, but he's also doing something else. And I realized that he may be the guy that's briefing the president. We should listen to everything he's doing. And then I started to realize he was having these conversations with Dan Smith. And Dan Smith is his best friend, is his guy who's his best man at his second wedding, godfather to Kashmir, the daughter. And Dan told me, I've had a number of conversations with him, and Dan is very eccentric. People think he's crazy because of the way he writes. He's very eccentric. He's got 2 master's degrees. He's super rich. He's never had to work. And he just plays he calls himself the chief eschatologist for the U.S. government. And he's into eschatology and he's into philosophy and that's the way he writes. So he words a lot of codes. So this is where you got all the bird names and he's using X's and Y's and you got to figure out who these people are and stuff like that. And once you figure it out, then you know what he's talking about. But you could go in there and you would have no idea what they're talking about. And so I talked to him and I said, well, how many conversations you had with Ron? And he said, I don't know, about 1,000, at least 1,000 conversations with Ron Pandolfi. And he's telling all these stories. Like when he first met Ron, it is 1991. He says, Ron, he was looking at crop circles. Him and, I forgot her name. She's died now, a researcher. They're doing crop circles. And he was poking around, and he got a hold of somebody and said, I need some information on crop circles. What do the Americans know? And he said, well, here's this guy's phone number. And he gives him Ron Pandolfi's phone number. He phones Ron Pandolfi, and he says, I'm interested in crop circles. And so Ron meets him. And then Ron says, one of the most important things that people got to remember, he says, we have a phenomenology problem. And that's what everybody misses. They think this is UFOs. It's not. It's phenomenology. It's everything. Mm-hmm. It's psychic phenomena. It's all the same thing. It's all connected.
Well, I was actually about to ask you that. What did the Weird Desk focus on? It wasn't just UFOs, right?
It wasn't. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Kit Green, for example, he was the control officer for the remote viewing program for 20 years. So it was remote viewing. It was anything that was weird, bump in the night, because they already knew. And I pointed this out. 1950, you got to remember, the Canadians wrote a top secret memo in 1950 based upon what the Americans had told Wilbert Smith, who was a high-level Canadian guy. And he said the Americans told the officials, not people on the street, officials told me the following things. Flying saucers exist. It's the most highly classified subject in the United States, rated 2 points higher than the hydrogen bomb, which would not be built till 2 years after the memo was written. It's of tremendous significance to the Americans, and there's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush who are trying to figure out the modus operandi. Then the very next line, Wilbur Smith says, and I was also told by American officials that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. The Americans aren't doing very well because they said if we are working on the problem, they're willing to exchange credentials and talk to us. So in 1950, the Americans knew to tell the Canadians that mental phenomena was involved. How would they know? Because nobody had talked to an alien. It wasn't until 1952 when Adamski talked to the alien. Before then, nobody was talking to aliens. So how did they know that there was a mental phenomena? Because the whole idea was 3 dead aliens and 1 live alien at Roswell, and the alien was talking in people's heads. And they went, oh my God, the thing's talking in our heads. Boy, would we like to get that. And so they knew already in the beginning of this whole game that mental phenomena was a big part of this whole thing. And plus they had the craft. And the craft, I wrote the book about the people piloting the crafts, UFO sky pilots. And I got 36. Now I've got maybe 50 people and all tell the same story. The craft is alive. The craft is conscious. This is what artificial intelligence is going to look like 5,000 years from now. It's intelligent. You put your hand on the craft. You become one with the craft. You're thinking what the craft thinks. The craft is talking to you. And wherever you want to go, the craft will take you exactly where you want to go just by thought. And that's this whole part. So the phenomenology is this whole idea that it's all the same thing. They were parsing it, almost like Ray Hernandez, if you've interviewed him. That was the vision that he had after I gave a consciousness lecture he was at. A couple days later, he's on the Miami freeway, and he gets pulled from his car in this out-of-body type experience, and there's this wheel spinning, and they're showing him this wheel, and it's got remote viewing, and it's got psychic phenomena, and it's got crop circles, and it's got this, and it's got that, and the wheel is spinning, and in the middle is consciousness. And whoever was talking to him said, you got to quit parsing this stuff. It's all the same thing. And that's what they've realized that people in the UFO community haven't realized. In fact, now, as I pointed out, very unfortunately, at Seoul, they're cutting out the consciousness thing. And Nolan was on an interview just recently, and he said he knows it's important, but we can't go there. We're same as James Fox will not put in his documentary anything about experiences. We can't go there. We don't want to be the weird guys who are talking about experiencers and, channeling and shit like this. So you cut it out. And the idea with Soul now is that we're going to teach people the nuts and bolts and get them accustomed to nuts and bolts. Then we'll bring the consciousness thing in, but that's not going to work because we've done this for 80 years. We've taken photographs and testimonies and stuff like that, and it hasn't gotten us anywhere. The nuts and bolts has not gotten us anywhere. You've got to talk to the people who are talking to the craft. And that's what Ron did in this one thing. I asked Dan Smith, I said, hey, did Ron write this thing? And he said, maybe. And he says, lights in the sky produce no usable information. Oh, he said, because we cannot control the phenomena, we watch those that the phenomena affects. Lights in the sky have no usable information. And then this is this whole idea. So that's why they will watch Chris Bledsoe. That's why all the intelligence people were there. That's what they said to Chris when he said, why are you on my property? Why you're disturbing my kids? You're destroying my life here. And then he said, well, Chris, you seem to have contact with these beings and we don't. They don't seem to like us. And we're here to find out what they're telling you. And that's the whole deal. They're really not talking to the government. And so you go to the contactees and they will tell you this idea that when you get on board the craft, it's bigger on the inside than outside, which actually may be a display. It may not be really real. It may be a display that shows you time and space. They're trying to give you the lesson that time and space is not the same. Or when you get an experiencer like Susie Hansen, who goes on the craft, and she says, they say, okay, we're going to make the craft bigger. And she says, the walls start to move outside the craft. They're moving. And she said it got so big she couldn't see the walls anymore. And the first woman that told me that she flew the craft, this 75-year-old lady, said, "Oh, they got crafts that are as big as the solar system." And I'm thinking, "Are you insane, lady? Come on!" And now you start to realize this thing that this stuff is so far ahead. But until you talk to people who've been in the craft, who will talk to you about, you can see in 360 degrees. And when I heard that, I went, 360 degrees, that's what out-of-body experienced people say, the same thing. Or it's within you. That's what they told the people when you fly the craft. They say, "Where would you like to go?" And then the one guy said, "I'd like to see the Milky Way from a distance." Okay, it's within you, Ron. Go within yourself. When you can imagine it, then we'll go there. And he imagines it, and 1 second later he said, boom, he said, there it is, and he's outside. And that's the kind of stuff that just blows you, almost like Lukatsky. When Lukatsky said, we got inside the craft. And the important thing that he said there that everybody leaves out in the UFO community, they say, well, it's all a cover-up. Nobody's being briefed. They're bypassing Congress and stuff like that. He said, I was in a congressional facility with a senator, and we had the discussion about getting inside the craft. And it was a long meeting. I can't tell you the whole meeting. I can just tell you we were inside the craft. And of course, Corbell and Knapp, who were doing the interview, I was saying, well, what was inside the craft? And he said, if you knew the answer, I can't do that. I have to get it approved, and maybe it'll be in the next book. But if you knew that, you'd realize that the whole rest of the book is just primitive. And this is this old idea. When you talk to people inside the craft, the one guy told me, he said he's in the craft, and the alien just put his hand up on the wall, and this book came out of the wall. And it was the same thing. They can make the craft as big as they want. And the idea that you can take a grain of sand, and inside there's a universe. It's this whole idea that time and space, we've got it all messed up. But when you don't know that until you talk to an experiencer who says, as soon as I was there, I was going through a wall, which you shouldn't be able to do, or I got in there and the time and space, there's no time and space. Or I talked to Chris Bledsoe. I said, Chris, what about the engine, Chris? You told me you were flying this orb. They're taking you around the world with this orb. And he said, yeah, it was like glass, but I could touch it, but I couldn't. It wasn't glass. I could touch it. Like there's something there. And he said, Grant, it wasn't 4 hours. It was 4 months. I was gone for 4 months. And that's this thing. When you talk to experiencers, this whole thing where time starts to be really weird as to what's really going on here. But you're not going to learn that by looking at lights in the sky. You're just going to learn that there's really something to it. And that's what Lukatsky said. When Lukatsky said, we learned it's like driving down a freeway and every single car is different. And his indication was 200,000 sightings. They were all different. That there was the whole idea of like snowflakes. They're all different. And so what are you going to learn by looking at things that are all different? You got to go to the experiencer, and then you start realizing these weird things that we got this wrong. Time and space is probably wrong. And if these beings can actually do what people talk about is you put your hand on the craft, you become one with the craft, it's conscious, and you go instantaneously, not like flying there. And that's what you see in remote viewing. When people are doing remote viewing, you don't get the guy there and he says, well, hang on, I'm flying to the site. I'll be there in a minute. It's like he's instantly at the site, which gives you the indication there may not, as Jim Semivan says, and I always say to people, what did he mean? He says, there does not appear to be any there. What the hell is he talking? This is a guy who got 8-hour briefing. When he says there does not appear to be any there, it's this whole idea that it's all an illusion. Your mind is taking in electromagnetic waves. It's creating this thing, and it's all happening inside your head, and they can get in there, and they're at a different vibratory level. They just move you to a different vibratory level, and that nothing is going to be right. Anything that we think we think everything's solid. We think the earth is flat. The sun goes around the earth, and it's wrong. Everything is wrong, and that's what the intelligence is trying to tell us with all these weird things by taking people on board and showing them these things. Is they told me you haven't got a clue. They say you think you know what's going on. You haven't got a clue, and I've told that at least 4 or 5 times. You haven't got a clue. And that's what Lukatsky says. You haven't got a clue. And this is the whole idea that I say, hey, if you say that the government is covering this thing up, that there's this Illuminati that's running the government, what the hell's the senator doing in his meeting? That was Reid, and it's been confirmed to me that it was Harry Reid. And that's the Gang of Eight. And that's exactly what Semivan says. The Gang of Eight is being briefed, which means this is all legal. And that's what they said to Jim Semivan. Is this legal? He said, yeah, it's legal. It's a PED. And I don't know if you've discussed this before, you and I, but the whole PED idea is that Eisenhower did it. And that was the idea that you got to protect like continuity of government. If there's a nuclear attack, security for the president. There's 19 or 20 of these PEDs that have been written, Presidential Emergency Action Documents. And they determined the UFO might be an invasion. So you do this action document, and then the president can bypass Congress, and he can just say, you, me, and these 5 people are read in. Nobody else is read in on this thing. And that makes the situation where the Congress says this is ours, and Semivan says, no, it's not yours. It's the executive branch. This is owned by the executive branch, and the executive branch runs it. And so that's where I think we're starting to learn how these things were pieced together and how they were covered up, and how Congress can bang their head against. And even when Semivan says, I didn't realize this, that Congress people are only briefed at a secret level. I went, what? It's like, holy cow. And even on the Intelligence Committee, they're only briefed at a top secret level. And that in order to get the SCI stuff, you need a clearance. And that's why they're having so much trouble, is you can ask all you want, but if you don't have the clearance, they can't tell you. It's the old idea. If you've got a USAP, you got to lie about it. If they ask you, you have to lie about it. You cannot acknowledge the program, because the acknowledgement of the program is a leak. It will give the Russians an idea that you're actually working on it, and that's what you don't want. So you start to see this game that's playing, and I think people are sort of missing the boat on this whole thing, because they're still trying to do the nuts and bolts. Everybody's into, we're going to get free energy, we're going to get money and stuff like this. And I say, you're not even thinking this thing through. As Walker said to us, what do you do when you finally figure it out? And you ask people, what are you going to do? And he said, curiosity is not sufficient need to know. Why should we change the rules and regulations to satisfy your curiosity? And people won't admit it's curiosity. And it is curiosity, because people, they want to know what's going on. And then they'll say, okay, we do have crafts, we do have bodies. And then so that's curiosity. You're answering the guy's curiosity. And what happens? The guy's just curious again. So where are they from? You answer that question. Okay, what are they doing here? And it's like a million questions. It'll never stop. The curiosity just keeps going. And the bottom line is, why are they here? What's the message? Which we're avoiding in this whole consciousness thing, which lies at the bottom of this whole thing, that if you cut that out, and this other aspect of why they may be sitting over military properties, because and I'm still trying to find the map. There's actually a map, because people talk about, like, this happened yesterday. Oh, they're doing this. And I go, the nuclear weapon thing, like, why do people keep using the Malmstrom example? That was 1967. That was a long time ago. I mean, when's the last time they did it? 2010 was the last time they were over top of a nuclear silo. So it's not like they're doing this all the time.
Well, they do it. It's not just silos, though. They're doing it over Lakenheath right now, still.
Over what?
Lakenheath. So.
Oh yeah, okay, but this is display stuff, and this is display stuff. So, yeah. But they're getting it, and we always sort of put it as if things are happening now. But I said there's a map from 1949. I'm sure it was drawn up by Ruppelt's people, which shows the same thing. Over Hanford, over military bases, it's the same thing. It's a message. And it's like they're saying, well, it's a threat. I mean, they made this F-22 change flight. Well, in World War II, my father was the U.S. Air Force, the Canadian Air Force. His boss had Foo Fighters, and they were on the edges of the plane. Forget about 50 feet away. They're on the edges of the plane. They've been doing this forever. And it's just messaging. It's all messaging. And we want to turn it into a threat, because the whole idea of the threat is it's weapons of mass destruction 2.0. We have to have a threat. Otherwise, we're not going to get any money. We've got to scare the living daylights out of people. And the idea is, when you can sell fear, you can sell anything. And that's what's going on here.
Now, kind of going to, you mentioned continuity of government.
Yeah.
There are rumors that the drone flap triggered that. Have you heard that? There's a lot of anecdotal data. There's a lot of anecdotal data showing, like, upgrades at Mount Weather, which is supposed to have been closed, right, and not used anymore. You have Schumer using code words in public about, I forget what the code word is. It's like, I forget what the lockstep. Whoa. Lockstep is the thing that they. Wow,
I'll have to look this up, because I wrote an article on this. I wrote a whole article about the fact that everybody's missed this. One of Greer's witnesses, he was a lawyer. Early on, I actually interviewed him. I phoned him, interviewed him, and asked him about this. He actually said that the whole UFO cover-up is run out of Mount Weather, and that makes total sense, because Mount Weather, if there's a nuclear exchange, you're not going to be doing any communications out of the White House. Let me guarantee you, it's going to be gone. Mm-hmm. You need a secure facility. And if you have a UFO, an attack, whatever it is, that's where all the secure facilities, all the communications to all the military, to all the embassies, it's all in Mount Weather. And this guy said that it's run out of Mount Weather. And if you go back to Blue Book and you see the Kecksburg crash, you take a look at the Kecksburg crash, there's a message that comes across the night of the Kecksburg crash from Michigan, where the guy says 2 pieces of metal have been found in Michigan, and he uses the word code green grass. And that's the code for Mount Weather. And when you put those two together, and then you see the whole thing, it's the secure facility. And I write a whole article about the special special secure facility inside Mount Weather. That's where they're running this whole operation out, and it's FEMA. It would make sense because as I told you, I'm going to be interviewing this Pines guy, and he said he was working on different war game things and stuff like that for FEMA, and he didn't hear anything about UFOs. But I'm going to say, well, okay, is there a level above you? I mean, you're at a GS-12 level. I mean, do you think maybe they got a black ops thing? And FEMA is the place where you'd have to do it. I mean, if one scenario, I mean, there's going to be a UFO invasion. Can you imagine there's UFO invasion? And then FEMA goes, hey, we never thought about that. We got no plan. Of course they got a plan. It's not that, and that's the whole deal. Is they've got this whole thing operating. And the more you see it, like, what was the other thing that happened? It was John Alexander did an interview a number of years ago. And he said, I was told about the MJ-12. MJ-12 actually did exist. And he said, except it's got nothing to do with UFOs. It's got to do with continuity of government. So, of course, I'm trying to find out who told John Alexander about this. And I found out it was Hal Puthoff told him this, that Hal Puthoff told him it was continuity of government. And that, again, is the MJ-12. And that's what the Robert Collins, who was in this documentary, this 1988 documentary, who was a physicist at Wright Patterson Air Force Base, was the Avery Condor figure, and was Ron Pandolfi tried to get him in the CIA and stuff like that. And he's the one that said the Special Facilities Division inside Mount Weather is a cover for MJ-12. And so you start seeing all these pieces and you go, oh, this makes sense. And then you take a look at Paul Hellyer. So what did Paul Hellyer and I was sitting right beside him when he did this. I was like, just shocked. We had a news, sort of like a citizens hearing thing in Canada. And there was instead of senators and congressmen, there was reporters, and they were sitting there and they were asking questions, and it was going around the questions and stuff like that. So it comes to Paul Hellyer and they say, who in the government knows? And he goes, I really don't know. Maybe the head of the Privy Council. And you can tell he's guessing, I don't know. And it goes around and comes to the next question. And before Paul answers the question, he says, oh, I do know somebody who actually knew what was going on. And he said, I got a phone call from an Air Force guy, a friend of mine. And he said, this guy is dying. He's got Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. And he's got something he wants to get off his chest. And he's decided, Paul, you're the guy he wants to tell. And so Paul says, well, what? And he says, because I'm going to do with UFOs. And he said, okay, I'll phone him. And he doesn't phone him. And the guy phones him back, the Air Force guy. He says, Paul, he's about to go off the cliff. You better talk to him. So Paul talks to this guy, and the guy is the head of emergency management. He's like the FEMA head in Canada. He said, I just want to let you know, Paul, it's all real. It's all real. I was taken to Washington. I was taken to Langley. I signed my damn life away. And I was taken, I sat inside a craft. They actually let me sit inside a craft. And I just want to let you know it's real. And that makes sense. It's the FEMA thing. These guys would have to know, because you're worried about the bank runs on the bank, the stock market melting down. Oil's not worth anything. You'd have to have a FEMA plan to deal with this. And so,
Grant, that's horrifying. I mean, you saw how FEMA, kind of their performance in Tennessee, right? Yeah. There were former Green Berets had to go in there to clean up for FEMA, and FEMA was basically confiscating supplies from people who were trying to help. So if they're there to kind of do something, that just means that most of us will have to fight ETs and FEMA at the same time.
Yeah. They even had a book that it's on, you can find it on Greenwald's site. They had a book that came out on FEMA emergencies, and one of the chapters was on a UFO crash. And of course, the UFO people picked up on it, and immediately it was gone. But they John Greenwald managed to get it before this chapter disappeared. So they did actually put it in an open manual. I don't know why they let it go in an open manual, but and that makes sense. Like because government's into fear. What's the scenario? This is going to happen. That's going to happen. Who's the enemy and stuff like that. And we even got now Canada is the enemy. We're now not threat to national security. And it's like, hey, we play hockey here. Like, what the hell is this? And that's you're always looking for enemies, because that's how you sell your budget. Eh? That's how you get bigger budgets and more money.
Well, I mean, my view is our elites. Our elites are a threat to national security. I mean, they're this close to being. I don't think Trump's gonna save us. I think. I don't know. Anyway, that's a whole separate topic.
Well, my thing is, whatever happens, it's going to be an experience. It's like, whatever happens, it's like, you could have been born in a poor person in Calcutta or whatever, and you didn't get that. You got here. We may be going back to that, and we'll learn whatever the experience is. Everything, and if it's a reincarnation world, everything is experience, and it's how we deal with it, not so much which cards are dealt to us. But yeah, it's kind of unstable sort of time, but it's maybe that's when we learn the lessons. Because when things are going well, then we're all like egos. Oh, we got this all under control. Yeah, let's have a beer, and you sort of let off. Where even this latest thing, I don't know if you did this thing with the latest with the telepathy tapes. I did an interview with, and it's the biggest podcast now. And this is this thing where this is consciousness that we can prove. We absolutely can 100% prove that telepathy exists. And the tests are about to take place. There's 4 or 5 different universities that Diana Hennessy Powell, and I actually asked Diana Hennessy Powell about the thing about, because I'd done a lot of study on this with these autistic, and I said, a trauma is always involved in this. When you get people who are very psychic, you're always going to see some sort of trauma in their background. And it's the idea it rips
same thing with paranoid schizophrenics. Same thing.
Yeah. It's just the circuit is not cut off. Whereas ours, we're like wearing blindfolds and we can't see it. So the consciousness thing with this, that's probably the most promising thing I've seen in 50 years is this work on the hill, the idea of the hill, all these kids talking about being on the hill telepathically, being able to 100% score on telepathic tests and stuff like that. And I asked Diana Hennessy Powell, who's the one that discovered all this, I said, will this flip the world upside down? She said, yeah, it will. It absolutely will, because the whole materialistic paradigm goes out the window. It's like there is a non-local part to the universe, and this communication is taking place. And then you get with these kids, like every single one of them can speak other languages. And explain this: the kid couldn't even type, he couldn't even spell till 3 weeks before they taught him to do this, and he's speaking foreign languages, and they're talking to dead people, and they're telepathically meeting on this hill, and they're claiming they're getting messages from God, and they're precognitive and stuff like that. This is just revolutionary. This is like the New York Times version of the New York Times 2017 article for the paranormal. This is going to blow things wide open. Even the numbers I went to the UFO committee, and like I went to Kit Green, and Kit Green said to me, he said, I'm very interested and I'm watching closely, but he still hasn't done anything. I went to Bigelow's consciousness person, Nick Cook, and he said, you're the 5th person this week that has sent me. I sent the interview I did with Kai Dickens, who's running they're doing this big documentary. They got 80% of the financing for this documentary with these telepathic kids. And he said, you're the 5th person that sent it, and yet nobody's really made a move on it. Nobody's really seen the significance. And then I always point out that Soul has cut this out. You're not allowed to talk about consciousness at Soul. You got to talk about nuts and bolts and government conspiracies and all that kind of stuff, and then you're in. But the main piece, everybody's missing this main piece, which maybe this telepathy tape is so powerful a podcast that it may flip this whole thing around, where a lot of people are going to start looking at this. And I even had a guy challenge me from McGill University, and that's, of course, where MK Ultra started. Or not where started, but it was one of the main MK Ultra places. Mm-hmm. And that's where they got Maria Beauregard. They kicked him out because he was doing consciousness in the neurology. He was doing experiments on consciousness in the neurology section. They kicked him out. So there's going to be no spirituality in here. And he confronted me, and he said, this is, they're using sleight of hand and the kids are peeking and all this bullshit, And I said, hey, would you like to be a part of this? And I said, hey, we could have you as being part of the experiment. You could sit in the chair like the kids and show us how easy it is to do this, and pick off the number, made up words that they use, and numbers and calculations and stuff like that. Just see you do it. And he said, no, not me. There's a guy in the United States that will watch. I said, no, we don't need the Pope here talking about sex and marriage. I want somebody who's actually going to be in the experiment. And dead silence. So it's like they're starting to attack already this telepathy tape, because this is powerful stuff. I mean, they can prove telepathy, and that flips everything upside down. Just absolutely annihilates a lot of the ideas we have about, and it confirms a lot of these ideas of experiencers about, being telepathic. The aliens are telepathic, being able to move from one place in the universe instantaneously to another, and that there may be no planets out there, that it's all inside us. And that's what I think Pandolfi is going to maybe say when he comes on camera, is it's got to do with the quantum realm. It's below the quantum realm where this stuff is happening.
All right, Grant, I think now's as good a time as any to end the episode. I look forward to speaking with you the next topic, which is what the heck's going on in New Jersey and the United States with all these drones. So an absolute pleasure again, my friend.
Super. Yeah.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.